I moved to Maplewood Estates for the quiet. The neighborhood wasn't fancy, no towering gates, no pretentious country club feel, but it had charm. Lining the edge of my backyard was a small, clear water creek. In the summer, I'd sit on the old cedar bench and listen to the gurgle of the water, the rustle of reeds, and the soft splash of trout darting after insects. That creek was my favorite part of this property. Unfortunately, it was also the part that caught the attention of her. Karen Whitmore had been HOA president for nearly 8 years, and by the looks of it, she had no intention of relinquishing the role. Tall, with an immaculate helmet of blonde hair and a wardrobe that screamed catalog perfection, she treated the neighborhood as though it were her personal dollhouse. Every blade of grass, every paint shade, every flower bed, nothing escaped her judgment. We first crossed paths in the most Karen way possible. She appeared on my porch unannounced, clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "Mr. Collins," she said, eyes flicking toward my backyard, "there's a concern I need to address. Your water feature is not in compliance with HOA guidelines." I blinked at her. "Water feature? That's a creek. It's been there longer than any of us have been alive." "It's unsightly," she replied, as if that settled the matter. "And a potential hazard. Standing water attracts mosquitoes. Children could fall in. I'll be issuing a notice for removal." The absurdity almost made me laugh. You can't remove a creek. It's part of the natural landscape. Also, it's flowing water, not standing. Her lips thinned further. "I'm simply doing my duty. Expect an official notice by the end of the week." And so it began. The notice came exactly as promised, printed on crisp HOA letterhead, complete with a threat of fines if I didn't correct the violation within 30 days. I sent it straight back with a short letter of my own, complete with environmental statutes proving that altering a natural waterway without permits was illegal. That's when the real harassment started. Weekly compliance checks on my property. Anonymous complaints about noise when I had friends over. Even a written reprimand for leaving my trash cans out an extra day after storm-delayed pickup. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was waging a petty war. I learned she had allies on the board, retired neighbors who either feared crossing her or enjoyed her crusades. Together, they operated with smug efficiency, confident no one could challenge them. Still, I refused to budge. The creek stayed. Weeks passed, the tension thickening like summer humidity. Whenever I saw her SUV creeping by, she'd slow just enough to glare toward my backyard, her gaze snagging on the water glinting in the afternoon sun. One afternoon, I caught her there, not in her SUV, but on foot, standing at the edge of my property line with a man in a neon safety vest. They were pointing at the creek, gesturing toward the slope, scribbling on a pad. I stepped outside. "Need something?" Karen turned with a bright, brittle smile. "Oh, just assessing the area for community improvements." "On my property?" I asked. "On common grounds adjacent to your property," she countered, stressing each word as though rehearsed. The man with her didn't look at me, just kept measuring, jotting numbers, muttering about flow and fill material. I didn't like it. Not one bit. That evening, I did some digging, both online and through a couple of neighbors who didn't drink Karen's Kool-Aid. I learned about previous improvements she'd spearheaded, cutting down an ancient oak because it blocked sunlight to a row of imported roses, repainting mailboxes in a color she called executive taupe, but everyone else called muddy brown. In every case, resistance had fizzled out. People either gave in or moved away. Karen was used to winning. But this wasn't a mailbox or a tree. This was the creek, my creek, and I wasn't about to roll over. The following Saturday, I staked small signs along the water's edge. Protected natural waterway, federal law, do not disturb. I took photos, timestamped them, and filed copies with the county environmental office. For a week, nothing happened. The tension almost seemed to fade. But then, one Monday morning, I opened my blinds to a sight that froze me in place. At the far end of the creek, just beyond my fence line, sat a row of orange construction cones. Behind them, stacks of wooden forms, rebar, and bags of ready-mix cement. A portable mixer stood idle, like a predator waiting to pounce. And standing there, overseeing it all with the smug satisfaction of a queen surveying her conquest, was Karen. Our eyes met across the distance. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just turned to the workers, clapped her hands, and pointed directly at the flowing water. In that moment, I knew the war over the creek was about to turn into something far uglier. The rumble of machinery jolted me awake before sunrise. It wasn't the polite hum of a lawnmower or the distant whir of a leaf blower. It was the grinding, metallic churn of heavy equipment. I threw on a jacket and stepped into the cold morning air. My breath hung in front of me as I rounded the side of the house. They were already at it. A small crew of workers in reflective vests moved with mechanical precision, lugging bags of cement toward the creek bed. The portable mixer clanged as it turned, spitting out thick, gray sludge into wheelbarrows. Wooden forms had been hammered into place across the water's path, forcing the flow into a narrow channel before dumping into a makeshift basin. And standing in the middle of it all, arms crossed, hair perfect, clipboard in hand, was Karen. I stormed over to the fence. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She didn't even look surprised. "Community beautification project," she said, voice syrupy. "The HOA approved it. You can't pour cement into a natural creek. It's illegal." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're not blocking it, Mr. Collins. We're improving it, making it safer. The board has deemed it necessary to prevent erosion and eliminate mosquito breeding grounds. You should be thanking us." "Mosquito breeding grounds? It's flowing water," I snapped. "And erosion is part of the ecosystem." "Spare me the nature lecture," she said, waving to a worker who wheeled another load toward the creek. "The paperwork is in order. If you have a problem, take it up with the board." I knew exactly what that meant. The board was Karen and two of her closest allies, a rubber stamp for whatever she wanted. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "You're on notice. I've contacted the county environmental office and—" She cut me off with a smirk. "Oh, we've already filed with them. Stagnant water hazard, remember? They signed off." My stomach dropped. Stagnant water hazard? That was a false claim, and she knew it. But it explained how she'd gotten the green light. For the next 2 hours, I watched in helpless frustration as the crew poured cement over the creek bed, sealing off the gentle flow that had run there for decades. The trout darted frantically in the shallows, trapped between the forming wall and the shrinking water. By midday, the downstream trickle had gone silent. By evening, the creek was gone, buried under a smooth, gray tomb. I sat on the cedar bench, staring at the stillness. The reeds sagged without the current to brush against them. The air, usually scented with moss and fresh water, felt stale. When the county returned my call the next morning, it was with bureaucratic indifference. "We've reviewed the submitted documents," the clerk said, "and the HOA acted within the parameters of the hazard mitigation guidelines." "Hazard mitigation?" I repeated, incredulous. She lied on the forms. "If you believe there's been a misrepresentation, you can file an appeal," the clerk said. Though I should note, these cases can take months to review. Months. By then, the cement would be set in stone, literally. Over the next week, Karen doubled down. She sent a newsletter to the community praising the successful restoration of a safety hazard. She framed it as a public service, citing reduced risk of flooding and increased property values. I nearly choked when I read that last part. Neighbors were split. Some congratulated her. Others whispered to me in private that it was wrong, but they didn't want to get involved. Fear of retaliation kept them silent. I tried to focus on work, but every glance out the window stabbed at me. My sanctuary was gone, replaced by a dull scar of concrete. The worst part wasn't even the destruction. It was the smug certainty that Karen had won. Then the weather shifted. Local forecasts began warning of an incoming storm system, unusually heavy rainfall for this time of year. At first, it barely registered. Rain was rain. But one evening, as I stood in the backyard, I noticed something. Where the creek used to run freely, rainwater now pooled against the cement wall, inching higher by the day. The ground beneath my feet was spongy, saturated. And when I walked toward the property line, I realized something else. The slope funneled that water in only one direction, toward Karen's house. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. But I knew the lay of this land better than anyone. And I knew that water always found a way. I didn't say a word. I just watched. The storm was still days away, but nature was already sharpening its knives. The first storms were modest, steady rain that darkened the soil and tapped against my windows like impatient fingers. The cement wall, still an unnatural gray against the green of the yard, held firm at first. But the water no longer whispered and slid away. It gathered. By the third day, shallow pools had formed upstream, creeping outward like an uninvited guest. I noticed the earth softening, blades of grass half drowned in muddy water. The air took on that sharp, mineral scent that comes when the ground is holding more than it can bear. Karen, of course, acted as though nothing was amiss. I spotted her one afternoon arranging ceramic planters on her front porch, oblivious to the invisible forces rearranging the land beneath her. She'd won her little battle, and in her mind, the war was over. I kept my mouth shut. By the fourth storm, things began to change faster. The rain came harder, its drumming so constant it felt like the sky had forgotten any other sound. The pools in my backyard deepened, pushing against the cement barrier until the surface shimmered like a silver mirror. That's when I saw it, the faintest of streams seeping from the far edge of the pool, trickling away from my yard and toward Karen's property. The land sloped gently in her direction, a fact she had either never noticed or had arrogantly dismissed. Water, patient as time, was making its choice. I began documenting everything. Photos of the rising waterline, close-ups of the small fissures forming at the edges of the cement, even short video clips of the trickle's steady growth. Not because I intended to interfere, but because when the reckoning came, I wanted proof of exactly how it happened. Karen's attitude toward me didn't change. She still waved with that polished, performative cheer when we crossed paths, the kind that wasn't a greeting so much as a reminder of her dominance. But I noticed she had started wearing rubber boots when she stepped into her backyard. The first visible sign of her trouble came one morning when I saw a sump pump discharging from her basement side vent. The stream of water spat into her driveway, rushing toward the gutter. That meant water was already where it shouldn't be. The weather forecasts grew more ominous, dark icons of clouds and lightning strung across the coming week. Historic rainfall expected, the meteorologists warned, their voices tinged with cautious awe. The system was slow-moving, a perfect setup for saturation and runoff. When the main storm arrived, it didn't arrive quietly. Sheets of rain hammered the rooftops, rattled the windows, and blurred the horizon into a wall of gray. The cement barrier was no match for the sheer volume pressing against it. The water pooled until it overflowed the edges in several places, cutting new rivulets into the soil. One of those rivulets had grown into a miniature stream, sliding invisibly under Karen's cedar fence and vanishing into her manicured lawn. I imagined it seeping downward, worming through the soil toward the lowest point of her property, the basement. Late that night, during a break in the rain, I walked to the edge of my property. Her house was dark except for a single basement window, where a pale yellow light glowed. Inside, I could see her pacing, phone in hand, lips moving fast. Her free arm gestured sharply toward the far wall, out of view. I didn't need to see it to know what was happening. The water was winning. By morning, the rain had returned, heavier than before. Reports came in of road closures and minor flooding across town. My backyard had transformed into a reflective sheet of water, the old creek's path marked now only by the places where the overflow was carving its way back into the land. Karen's property, meanwhile, looked untouched from the street. Her perfectly clipped hedges stood as they always had, her driveway pristine. But I knew what lay beneath. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table listening to the storm batter the siding, I heard it, distant at first, then clearer, the groaning whine of a wet/dry vacuum. The kind used to suck water off a basement floor. The sound went on for hours. The irony was delicious, but I kept it to myself. Nature doesn't shout when it takes revenge. It works quietly, invisibly, until the final blow. And I could feel it coming. The cement had stolen my creek. But it had also stolen Karen's safety. The next storm was forecast to be the worst yet. The storm rolled in like an army. Thick black clouds massed over Maplewood Estates, wind snapping branches, rain pelting down in endless sheets. By the time night fell, the gutters were overflowing, and the streetlights cast halos through a blur of water. From my back window, I could barely see the yard. The pool behind the cement wall had expanded into a small lake, the water lapping at the top edge and spilling over in several places. Each overflow streamed downhill toward Karen's property in fat, relentless currents. Around midnight, the first crack came. Not a noise from the sky, but from the earth. A deep, muffled pop, followed by a low, grinding moan as the soil shifted. The cement barrier, never meant to hold such weight, had begun to fail. I grabbed my camera and filmed as the center seam darkened with seepage. Water forced its way through hairline fractures, at first in thin jets, then in widening gushes. Minutes later, a whole section collapsed, releasing a surge of muddy water that roared downhill like a freed animal. Karen's backyard vanished beneath the flood in seconds. The water followed gravity's call straight toward her house. Through the pounding rain, I caught sight of her, framed in the basement window again, but this time waist-deep in swirling brown water. Her arms flailed as she tried to lift boxes onto shelves, her mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear over the storm. Within minutes, the water was chest-high. Objects floated past, plastic tubs, lawn chairs, a sodden rug. And then, in one surreal moment, a fish darted through the beam of her basement light. My fish. The very one she had driven out of my creek. The basement light flickered, then died, plunging the scene into shadow. I didn't move to help. The emergency crews would come, they always did, but this was nature's verdict, and I wasn't about to interrupt. By dawn, the rain had eased, but the damage was absolute. Karen's basement was a murky aquarium, the waterline visible against the walls like a scar. Her yard was littered with debris, and the cedar fence had partially collapsed under the weight of the flood. The HOA meeting that week was the quietest I'd ever attended. Karen arrived late, her hair limp, her makeup minimal. She wore rubber boots and carried a stack of paperwork, but her usual clipped confidence was gone. When she tried to call the meeting to order, someone interrupted. The county environmental inspector. He strode to the front of the room with a folder in hand and announced, in no uncertain terms, that the cementing of the creek had been an unpermitted alteration of a protected waterway. The false, stagnant water hazard report had been uncovered, paperwork signed by none other than Karen Whitmore. The fines were staggering. Restoration of the creek was mandated, with all costs to be covered by the HOA under Karen's leadership, costs that would, in turn, be billed back to her due to misuse of funds and fraudulent filings. Her resignation was not requested. It was demanded. She tried to protest, but her voice cracked. No one on the board came to her defense. Her allies avoided eye contact, eager to distance themselves from the sinking ship. I sat in the back, silent, letting the scene unfold. Over the next months, crews returned, not to destroy, but to rebuild. The cement was torn out piece by piece, the soil regrayed, the water coaxed back into its natural path. Fish were reintroduced. The reeds returned. And when the first spring thaw came, the creek sang again. Karen didn't last long after that. Her property value had plummeted, the smell of mildew clinging to her house despite endless repairs. One afternoon, I saw a "for sale" sign planted in her lawn. Weeks later, a moving truck swallowed her life whole and drove away without fanfare. I never saw her again. Some neighbors said it was all just bad luck, that the storm was an act of nature no one could have foreseen. But I knew better. Nature doesn't forget. As I sat on my cedar bench one evening, listening to the creek's familiar gurgle, I thought about that night when the fish had returned to her basement. It was the perfect symmetry. She'd tried to erase their home, and they'd made hers unlivable. The water flowed on, unbothered, as though nothing had happened. But I remembered. And I always would.